Thank you for joining us, Professor Justin Hastings, and we are going to discuss about the current economic approach of the DPRK North Korea to international community today. And Justin Hastings, Professor Hastings is a well-renowned, world-renowned scholar on the North Korean politics and other international relation and comparative politics in issues. All right. Again, thanks for joining us, Professor Justin Hastings, and then the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. So they asked me to speak about the current economic approach of the DPRK to the international community. And what I'm going to speak about are basically two projects that are related to North Korea and how it participates in markets. One is sort of how North Korea uses markets to evade sanctions first, and the second is how North Koreans use markets to build social trust. There is something tying these together. So the first question they asked me to answer was what methods and with which entities has North Korea employed to circumvent economic sanctions? And I think the general broad answer is North Korea is able to evade economic sanctions because it is entrepreneurial, right? This is a North Korean restaurant in Shenyang in China that I visited many years ago. And North Korea is out of the arduous march. North Korea developed an entrepreneurial culture that is comfortable basically engaging in lots and lots of different activities related to the markets. So what we see here is a number of different proliferation evasion strategies. Sort of all of these strategies, in some sense, are used by North Korea in various permutations to get what it wants. It uses state resources. It uses sort of obfuscation. It hides the identity of the people and the goods and the firms involved in transactions. It tries to structure its networks in a way that looks like it's a legitimate network, even though they're evading sanctions. It chooses which countries to do business with based on the gap between what the countries can do in terms of trade and what the countries are willing or able to do in terms of enforcement. And finally, North Korea just engages in a lot of good old-fashioned smuggling, sort of between North Korea and the countries around it. And the way in which it does this is by engaging in trade, right? So people have often asked me, how does North Korea actually evade sanctions, especially the sanctions that are designed to sort of identify North Koreans who are participating in the system? And the answer is they don't. They have someone else do it for them, right? I mean, that's the basic key, right? North Korea is embedded in global networks in a way that I think many people would be surprised to see. Sort of they are embedded in a series of brokerage systems or brokerage networks outside of North Korea that essentially mean that anytime a sort of buyer or seller is doing business with someone, they don't actually know they're doing business with North Korea, right? Because there's someone doing business on North Korea's behalf, either to buy it or sell it or move the goods or to make connections. And what this essentially means is North Korea is evading sanctions by being very good at sort of building connections around the world. So one of the ways they do this is by ship-to-ship transfers. So if we think about all the different ways in which North Korea evades sanctions, one of the things they do is engage in sort of transfers of oil and coal at sea as a way of getting around the sanctions that sort of are designed to stop them from using foreign ports and using North Korean flagged vessels. And so, in some sense, this is already showing how North Korea is using other countries as a way of evading sanctions. So we can see sort of diagrams. These are complicated. I'm not going to go over them in great detail of how North Korea works as a buyer country, how it works as a seller country, and how it works as a broker country. Right. And so we can see here in a typical ship-to-ship transfer where North Korea wanted to buy oil, they are heavily involved in a number of different countries and a number of different brokers doing business for them. And so we can see here is that North Korea wants to buy some oil. It's actually sort of a Hong Kong-based sort of brokerage that is the one that buys the oil from an international company based in Singapore and Switzerland. And the international company transports the oil on a Marshall Islands registered ship that's actually owned by a series of Taiwanese front companies. We're doing business on behalf of North Korea. There's an actual North Korean ship coming out and getting the oil, but the front companies are actually told the buyer that they are shipping oil from South Korea to Taiwan. In fact, they sort of met in the sort of south of South Korea and transferred the oil to a North Korean ship. So we see here that North Korea, in some sense, is only involved in receiving the oil, but they had a lot of people doing all the work for them in acquiring the oil to buy. We also see North Korea as a supplier country. Right, here is North Korea selling goods to Syria. We see that North Korean state-owned companies, state prerogatives, are in fact being used both through the sort of North Korean embassy in Damascus as a broker, as well as the original seller, which is Comid. sort of the main North Korean state weapons company. All right, and so what we see here is that, again, there's a number of North Korean connections, but a lot of the business is being done by other people, by sort of companies in China that are actually shipping the goods, by sort of front companies in Syria that are receiving the goods on behalf of the Syrian government, through a series of other front companies, and by North Korean offices, both in China and in North Korea, that are operating on behalf of COVID. And finally, sort of the interesting thing about North Korea is that because it has engaged in a lot of buying and a lot of selling as a way of evading sanctions, this actually makes it really good at brokering as well, because it has both, right? And brokering for North Korea is actually a lot less problematic than buying or selling, because North Korea never has to touch the goods, right? It doesn't have to enter North Korea. They don't have to leave North Korea. North Korea can make money and pursue its geopolitical aims simply by making sure that the buyer gets the goods from the seller, right? And in this case, this is an arms-related shipment to Syria, sort of about 10 years ago. And what we see is that Syria, through its front companies, wanted to buy a series of weapons that were produced by companies in sort of countries like Taiwan, Hong Kong, the US, Denmark, countries that don't necessarily want to sell weapons to Syria, right? And so what did they do? They approached ultimately a sort of a North Korean state-owned companies who, through their companies, it's a series of front companies owned by Chinese nationals. So here's third country nationals operating on behalf of North Korea, then engaged in sort of procurement for these supplier companies through Hong Kong and China, had the goods shipped to China, and then onward shipped to Syria. So from the perspective of the supplier companies, it looked as if they had never actually bought any goods or sent any goods to Syria. They were selling them to China. Finally, I think North Korea, we're asking, well, how does North Korea actually get goods into or out of the country? They make extensive use of smuggling. They have 3 smuggling routes: by land, by river, or by sea, that both state-owned companies in North Korea and non-state companies can use, right? And so one of the things to keep in mind is that while North Korea does actually have a substantial state involvement in sort of a lot of its trade, a lot of the trade is actually done by people who are theoretically state-owned companies, but are actually fundamentally private, right? And that sort of leads to the second issue. What factors have contributed to the emergence of social trust in the context of daily political interactions, right? And I think what we can see here, this is based on a project I did with a number of other people on sort of the connection between North Korean market participation and potential building blocks for civil society in North Korea. We asked a number of North Korean defectors on living in South Korea, well, what was their experience participating in markets? And sort of what did they learn from that? And we came up with a basic framework which says, look, North Korea has a number of political and economic challenges in it. These challenges lead to a set of challenges that North Koreans face in participating in the market, including social trust is low, uncertainty is high, information is hard to acquire, and obviously enforcement of contracts is difficult. This leads in turn to a series of market participation strategies. And key to our argument is that by engaging in these market participation strategies, North Koreans, perhaps inadvertently, sometimes on purpose, build social trust. They build reciprocity and trust networks, right? They essentially build the building blocks of civil society through market participation and the way in which they participate in markets. So we can go through and think about sort of what these strategies are and what they actually result in. So the first thing is that North Koreans build networks. Right? These networks are often have state officials involved, both as partners, as providing political cover, as providing information for the markets, and engaged in goods buying and selling themselves. But North Koreans also use a number of personal connections, non-official, non-business connections to build these networks. And these networks are often the basis of North Korean business. North Koreans also rely on a number of personal interactions, both in terms of negative market reinforcing interactions. Obviously, the threat of retaliation can be high. Sort of vulnerability, mutual vulnerability can be very high in a semi-legal environment like this, as well as positive market reinforcing interactions. The reciprocity, repeated interactions lead to sort of greater trust. Sort of expanding your networks, buying and selling and sharing knowledge is all useful for basically building sort of trust in business relationships in North Korea. We also found that there's a good deal of transnational influence in North Korean markets as well, right? Partly this is because many North Koreans did in fact work abroad or have money from abroad to start up their businesses. They have startup capital from these. They have a number of Chinese connections, which can be used not only for business, but also for other purposes. And this is critical and I think kind of interesting. It's also the case that business, because it's in some sense not particularly sensitive in North Korea, it can provide a reason for why North Koreans have transnational ties. right? It was often the case that business served as a cover for transnational ties, mostly to China, that allowed North Koreans to bring in information or engage in sensitive activities. Right? And this is true even if there were state officials involved in the networks. More specifically related to the results of market participation, we see that sort of North Koreans, generally it is a sort of low trust society, but participating in markets, particularly over the long term, did allow North Korean respondents to build a reputation, and thus they built social capital. Right? It was specifically market participation that allowed them to build these connections and accumulate social capital. And in some sense, what we found is that social trust was necessary to run a business successfully. Right? So as they were sort of thinking about how to build businesses, even sort of businesses that they were sort of built on relationships, they realized that they actually had to have large degrees of trust and reciprocity in those relationships. And what this meant, and I think sort of what we see here then, is that if they wanted to participate in markets, they often required a continuous flow of information. Now remember, information is often very hard to come by in North Korea. So how do you get it? Right? You get it by a sort of virtuous cycle of having greater social capital, which allows you to share and receive information. Right? And this sort of social capital also allows you to help other people, which in turn allows you to get more social capital. And also to build market connections and build sort of information that you can use for acquiring more business. And what this means in some sense is that access to information is both a cause and effect of social capital, and social capital is both a cause and effect of success in business, right? And so what we saw in general is that the more social trust North Koreans had, the more social capital they had, the more successful they were in business. And you can see an example of this, sort of one quote, I'm not going to read it, but sort of the quote starts off with the idea that North Korea is a low trust society. Right? The first and foremost rule of business is to trust no one. And obviously that's sort of the general stereotype about North Korea. But by the end, the quote says, at least some trust is needed and should be built over time, right? So North Korea's low trust, but you actually need trust to survive. You need trust to do business well in North Korea, right? And the question of how you do that and how you build trust is very important for North Koreans. One of the things that they're able to do as a result of participating in markets is essentially building shared norms and understandings. And shared norms can come from three different, I think, very interesting sort of aspects of North Korean market participation. The first, and this is probably the most surprising, market information is not politically sensitive, right? It's okay to talk about how to make money in North Korea. It's okay to talk about business. And so in some sense, market information is one of the few kinds of information that is shared widely, right? Which leads to a shared norm of information sharing, right? Competition itself can drive people to adopt shared understandings about how much they're willing to sell for, right? And sort of buyers and sellers will monitor the prices so that they stay within acceptable ranges. Right? And finally, the fact that sort of all these market activities are not sensitive but still borderline illegal in North Korea means that in some sense there's a shared norm of maximizing survival rather than maximizing price. Right? If you maximize price, you might sort of minimize your chances of survival. Right? And so in that sense, maximizing profits is not the goal of North Korean business over the long term. It's maximizing networks that allow you to keep doing business. And finally, we see that sort of these sort of as North Koreans build these networks and as they do business, we see that these are in fact building trust networks, right? Sort of the trust networks themselves are created as a win-win for all participants. Obviously, sort of as North Koreans do business with each other on a repeated basis, repeated interactions incrementally lead to higher levels of trust. And so the trust networks themselves become more successful. And finally, sort of the shared interest people have within North Korea, not only in making money and trading goods, but also the fact that they're often in the same industry in the same region, as well as, I think, interestingly, the fact that they need to deal with the state collectively to protect their own interests. Which we saw sort of the beginnings of sort of collective action in North Korea as a result, comes through sort of trust networks built on these shared interests. So that's all I have. So thanks very much.
Thank you for your excellent and very succinct presentation, which contains a lot of materials. I would love to listen more on your the lecture item. Yeah, I mean it's interesting the contents at the same time. North Korea as a buyer country, and then supplier and seller countries, and then broker country, and then this diagram actually fascinating. I think it's based upon your research and the published material. I think it's 2017, 18 or something like that. That's
Right.
great. Yeah, I mean, and then again, just let us know, who are for this in North Korea as a trade, and who are the primary stakeholders? And then what are the roles of foreign entities? And you actually suggested, just give us China, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and then Switzerland. It's there are many countries, and then the players of those countries actually involved in this trade with North Korea. Who are the most important and then critical, should not be missing type of player in here?
So, I think if you're talking about who are the North Korean players, for example, right? Sort of the North Korean players, sort of the farther you get from North Korea, the more likely it is that it's the state-owned companies sort of directed sort of by the central government that are involved in this, right? The closer you get to North Korea, the more likely it is that there are functionally non-state companies involved in trade across the China-North Korea border, right? And so a lot of the trade that happens between China and North Korea before COVID and now increasingly since COVID is actually done by companies and by individuals that are paying off the state, or it might be sort of like state clients, but are not necessarily actually directly directed by the state, right? In terms of the foreign stakeholders, sort of the people that North Korea does business with, again, it sort of depends on sort of whether you're a buyer or a seller and sort of what you want from North Korea. If you're a seller, North Korea is the companies that are selling to North Korea indirectly often don't know they're selling to North Korea, right? That's what North Korea's sanctions evasion strategy is designed to do, right? And so, those companies are just regular companies, right? Regular companies in the US, regular companies in Europe, regular companies in Japan, and sort of they produce things that North Korea wants. Sort of the entities that are actually doing business directly with North Korea and know that they're doing business directly with North Korea are generally going to be somewhat smaller companies who are in the region, in sort of East Asia. So companies in Taiwan, companies in Hong Kong, in China, and companies in Singapore, although Singapore has significantly cracked down on it recently. And these are the companies that are doing business. They know they're doing business with North Korea. They are the ones that essentially serve as the front companies for North Korea, but they're not actually owned by North Koreans. Right? Generally, they're fairly small. Even the state of North Korea, the quantities of goods it wants are actually not huge. And so it's things that smaller companies can facilitate.
Smaller companies actually can participate and facilitate. And I think it's the interest, the margin of interest and profits is pretty small in many senses. And in comparison with, other, trading big giants in other parts of the world. But, it makes money. So they can.
Yeah, it makes money. I think sort of, if you look at sort of the companies that are involved, sometimes, and I did this in my own research when I talked to sort of Chinese traders and that did business with North Korea. For them, it's not necessarily the matter of huge profits. It's the matter of sort of lack of better options. Right? And then once you have the connection with North Korea and it works, then it's sort of a relatively consistent profit, which is not necessarily huge. If you're in northeastern China, you don't necessarily have a lot of other options when it comes to trade. So that's sort of the problem that they face, but also the advantage that North Korea has.
And then, my last question, how do you predict this evolutionary, path of this informal social trust building in the North Korean economy or North Korean society in general? Is it going to be a more, say, critical, variable for, North Korean political system or economic system and social system? And then might be already we see, many, the constraints and restraints by, regime itself. But, how do you see this evolutionary path of social trust building in the North Korean business world?
So, I think COVID obviously threw North Korea for a loop. We'll see sort of what emerges on the other side in terms of what the markets look like. But, one thing to keep in mind, and this is the project, how we approach the project, is that we don't pretend that this is going to change North Korea overnight. We think of this more as the basis, markets providing the basis for at least some elements of civil society if and when there's a change from the top, right? What that is, we can't predict. Whether that's some exogenous sort of shock, whether that's some change, from above inside North Korea, we don't know. But we say, well, the point of markets and the result of markets is that they're providing at least some sort of green shoots that could be used if and when North Korea does actually change and open up, right? So there is some basis for trust there in what you would generally think of as a very low trust society.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for your lecture, and then I very interesting in myself. I really enjoy the enjoyable conversation, Q&A session, lasting 20 minutes. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much.